touch him again, and you won't have hands to apologize with." Arthur's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that froze the entire diner. The patron who had accidentally bumped into the little boy backed away, trembling, eyes wide with terror as Arthur's bodyguard stepped forward from the shadows. At the center of the chaos stood a 6-year-old boy, completely unfazed by the sudden deadly silence in the room. He couldn't hear his father's threats. He couldn't hear the gasps of the onlookers. He only felt the vibrations of slammed tables. From behind the counter, Beatrice watched the terrifying man. Then, she looked at the isolated, frustrated child. Taking a deep breath, she untied her apron and walked straight toward the most dangerous man in the city. The neon sign of the Starlight Diner flickered with a persistent, annoying buzz that Beatrice had long ago learned to tune out. It was a Tuesday evening, the sky outside a bruised purple, and the rain was coming down in thick, relentless sheets. Inside, the diner smelled of stale coffee, heavily fried potatoes, and the damp wool of coats belonging to exhausted commuters. It was the kind of place people came to be forgotten, to disappear into a plate of cheap food and the anonymity of a vinyl booth. Beatrice wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen better days, her mind drifting to the stack of past-due bills waiting on her tiny kitchen table. The bell above the glass door didn't just jingle. It practically screamed as the door was violently shoved open. The icy wind howled into the warm diner, but it wasn't the weather that caused the sudden, suffocating drop in the room's temperature. 3 men walked in. The 2 flanking the rear were built like bank vaults, their eyes scanning the room with cold, professional paranoia. But it was the man in the center who commanded the absolute, terrifying attention of every soul in the room. Arthur. Even in this part of town, miles away from the glittering skyscrapers he owned, his face was recognized. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than the diner itself, his posture rigid, his dark eyes radiating a quiet, lethal authority. And gripping his massive, scarred hand was a small boy. The child, no older than 6, looked entirely out of place. He wore a neatly pressed miniature suit, but his tie was askew, and his eyes darted around the brightly lit room with a mixture of wonder and deep-seated anxiety. Beatrice watched from behind the pie case as Arthur steered the boy into the largest corner booth. The bodyguards took up positions at adjacent tables, effectively turning the corner into a fortress. The regular patrons suddenly found their plates of food incredibly fascinating, avoiding eye contact at all costs. Beatrice drew the short straw. Her manager, a sweaty man named Frank, had practically shoved his order pad into her hands and darted into the kitchen. Taking a deep, stabilizing breath, Beatrice smoothed her uniform and approached the booth. "Good evening," she said, keeping her voice even, refusing to let her hands tremble as she placed 2 menus on the laminated table. "Can I get you started with something to drink?" Arthur didn't look up at first. He was busy trying to take off the boy's coat. The child was resisting, squirming, his small face scrunched up in an expression of pure frustration. "Just coffee. Black," Arthur muttered, his voice a gravelly baritone that vibrated in Beatrice's chest. "And milk for the boy. In a glass that won't break." "Right away," Beatrice said, turning quickly. When she returned with the drinks, the situation at the booth had deteriorated. The boy was slapping his hands against the table, his mouth open in a continuous, silent cry. He was pointing desperately at the picture of a brightly colored milkshake on the menu, but Arthur was forcefully pushing a plate of plain toast toward him. "Eat, Leo. Stop this," Arthur said, his voice rising in volume, laced with a helpless anger that Beatrice immediately recognized. It wasn't the anger of a cruel man. It was the fury of a man who was used to controlling everything in his world, except the one thing that mattered most. The boy, Leo, didn't react to the volume of his father's voice. He simply couldn't hear it. He hit the table harder, the vibrations rattling the silverware. He knocked the glass of milk over. The white liquid pooled rapidly, dripping onto Arthur's immaculate trousers. Instantly, one of the bodyguards lunged forward, grabbing a stack of napkins. Arthur waved him off with a vicious, sharp motion, his face a mask of barely contained rage. He grabbed Leo by the shoulders, perhaps too firmly, trying to force the boy to look at him. "I said stop!" Arthur roared, the sound echoing through the silent diner. Leo's face crumpled. He wasn't crying from fear of the yell. He was crying from the absolute, crushing isolation of not being understood. He thrashed in his father's grip, a tiny bird trapped in a cage of incomprehension. Beatrice couldn't take it anymore. The self-preservation instinct that usually kept her invisible in the presence of dangerous men completely evaporated, replaced by a fierce, protective ache in her chest. She had seen that specific kind of frustration before. She had lived it with her own younger sister. Before the bodyguard could stop her, Beatrice stepped right up to the table. She completely ignored Arthur, kneeling down on the sticky linoleum floor so she was exactly eye level with the thrashing child. She reached out, gently but firmly placing her hands over Leo's wildly flailing fists. The physical contact startled the boy, and he froze, his tear-filled eyes locking onto hers. Then, Beatrice moved her hands. She brought her right hand up, forming the letter C, and moved it in a small circle near her chest. Hungry. Leo stared at her, his breath hitching. She pointed to the menu, then brought her hands together, intertwining her fingers and moving them in a stirring motion. Milkshake. She raised her eyebrows in a question. Do you want a milkshake? The change in the boy was instantaneous and miraculous. The rigid tension bled out of his small frame. His eyes went wide, reflecting the harsh neon lights. He looked at her hands as if they were performing magic. Slowly, hesitantly, his own small, trembling fingers came up. He formed the letter C and made the circle. Hungry. Then he pointed at the picture. Beatrice smiled, a warm, genuine expression that transformed her tired face. She tapped her chin with her fingers, moving them forward. Thank you. Then she patted her chest. Please. Leo mimicked the sign for please, a small, watery smile breaking through his tears. What are you doing? The voice was terrifyingly quiet. Beatrice slowly stood up and turned to face Arthur. The Mafia boss was staring at her, his dark eyes wide, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles twitched. He looked from Beatrice to his son, who was now sitting calmly, wiping his eyes, waiting patiently. I'm taking his order, sir, Beatrice said, keeping her voice incredibly calm, though her heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He understood you, Arthur whispered, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. He looked at his hands, then at hers. He doesn't do that. He screams. He breaks things. He doesn't talk. He just did, Beatrice said softly. He told me he wants the strawberry milkshake, not the toast. He told me he's very hungry, and he said please. The diner was dead silent. The bodyguards looked unsure of what to do, their hands hovering near their jackets. Arthur stared at Beatrice, stripping away the waitress uniform, the tired eyes, the messy bun, assessing her with a piercing intensity that made her want to shrink away. But she stood her ground, glancing back down to give Leo a quick, reassuring wink. Who are you? Arthur finally asked, his voice losing its threatening edge, replaced by a heavy, desperate curiosity. I'm Beatrice, she said, grabbing her order pad, and I'll be right back with that milkshake. The walk home from the diner usually took Beatrice 20 minutes. Tonight, she made it in 10. The damp night air chilled her through her thin coat, but the cold was nothing compared to the icy dread pooling in her stomach. She kept glancing over her shoulder, convinced the shadows stretching from the alleyways were moving. You didn't just walk up to a man like Arthur, interrupt his family dynamic, and walk away without consequences. In this city, interacting with his kind was like brushing against a live wire. You either got burned, or you died. She fumbled with her keys at the door of her crumbling apartment building, the metal scraping loudly against the rusted lock. Once inside, she threw the deadbolts, leaned her forehead against the peeling paint of the door, and closed her eyes. You idiot, she thought. You stupid, impulsive idiot. She walked into her cramped kitchen, turning on the tap to fill the kettle. As the water began to boil, she let her mind drift back to the boy, Leo. The way his eyes had lit up when he realized someone in that loud, chaotic world could finally understand him. It was a look she knew intimately. It was the same look her sister, born deaf, used to give her before she passed away. Beatrice had spent years mastering sign language, a skill that now gathered dust, useless in her day-to-day life of serving coffee and wiping down tables. Until tonight, a sharp, authoritative knock on her door shattered the silence of the apartment. Beatrice jumped, nearly dropping her favorite mug. The kettle began to scream. She turned it off with shaking hands. The knock came again, 3 measured, heavy thuds that vibrated through the floorboards. She walked to the door, her breath shallow. She pressed her eye to the peephole. standing in the dimly lit hallway were the two massive men who had flanked Arthur at the diner. "Miss Beatrice," one of them said, his voice surprisingly polite but carrying an underlying tone that made it clear this was not a social call. "Mr. Arthur would like a word." She opened the door, leaving the chain on. "It's past midnight. I'm tired. Whatever he wants, it can wait until tomorrow." "It really can't, miss," the second man said. He didn't move aggressively, but he didn't have to. The sheer mass of him blocking her hallway was intimidation enough. "There's a car waiting downstairs." Beatrice knew she had no real choice. Running would only make it worse. Resigned, she unlatched the chain, grabbed her coat, and followed them down the creaking stairs. The black SUV idling at the curb looked like a stealth bomber on wheels. One of the men opened the rear door. Beatrice climbed in, the scent of expensive leather and faint cigar smoke immediately enveloping her. The windows were heavily tinted, turning the passing city into a blur of smeared neon and shadows. They drove for nearly 40 minutes, leaving the cramped, dirty streets of her neighborhood behind. The buildings grew larger, the lawns wider, until they pulled up to a massive wrought iron gate that swung open silently at their approach. The estate was a fortress of stone and glass, perched on a hill overlooking the city lights. It looked cold. It looked lonely. She was escorted through massive oak doors into a foyer that echoed with the sound of her cheap sneakers on the marble floor. The house was dead quiet, save for the faint ticking of a grandfather clock. "In here," one of the men directed, pointing toward a set of heavy double doors. Beatrice stepped inside. It was a study, lined floor to ceiling with books that looked like they had never been read. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth. Sitting behind a sprawling mahogany desk was Arthur. He had discarded his suit jacket, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and faded tattoos. In the soft light of the desk lamp, he looked less like a monster and more like a deeply exhausted man. He didn't speak immediately. He gestured to a leather armchair opposite his desk. Beatrice sat, perching on the very edge, keeping her spine rigid. "I ran a background check on you," Arthur said, breaking the silence. His voice was flat, stating a simple fact. "Beatrice, 26, no criminal record, drowning in debt. You work double shifts to pay off medical bills for a sister who died 3 years ago." Beatrice felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks. "That's none of your business. When you approach my son, it becomes my business," Arthur countered smoothly, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "You know sign language." "Yes." Fluently. "Yes." Arthur looked down at a heavy crystal glass on his desk, turning it slowly. "Leo. The doctor said he was born with profound hearing loss. They gave me a stack of pamphlets, told me about special schools. But in my world, weakness is not an option. It is a liability. It is blood in the water. I have tried to force him to be normal, to read lips, to speak. I hired the best speech therapists in the country. And you fired them all," Beatrice guessed, her anger making her bolder than she should have been. "Because they told you what you didn't want to hear. That your son isn't broken. He just speaks a different language." Arthur's eyes snapped up to hers, a flash of dangerous fire in them. For a second, Beatrice thought she had pushed too far. But then, the fire died out, leaving only a hollow darkness. "He screamed for 3 hours after we left the diner," Arthur said softly. "Not because he was angry, but because he wanted to go back. Because you were the only person in his entire life who didn't look at him like a problem to be solved." He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick envelope, tossing it onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, substantial thud. "I want you to teach him," Arthur said. "I want you to come here 5 days a week. You will be his private tutor. You will teach him this language of yours. You will teach him how to communicate." Beatrice stared at the envelope. "I'm a waitress. I'm not a certified teacher. I don't care about certificates," Arthur said, his voice hardening back into the tone of a boss giving an order. "I care about results. That envelope contains more money than you make in a year. It clears your debts. It buys you whatever you want. In exchange, you give my son a voice." "And what about you?" Beatrice asked, locking eyes with him. "Are you going to learn?" Arthur stiffened. The question clearly caught him off guard. "I don't have time for games. I have an empire to run. I provide. You teach. That is the arrangement." Beatrice looked at the envelope. It was salvation. It was the end of sleepless nights worrying about eviction. But looking at Arthur, seeing the rigid, immovable wall he had built around himself, she knew the money came with a different kind of price. She would be stepping into a cage, beautiful and gilded, but a cage nonetheless. "I have conditions," Beatrice said, her voice steady. Arthur raised an eyebrow, a slight, almost imperceptible smirk touching his lips. "You are in no position to make demands. If I'm teaching him, I do it my way," Beatrice pressed on, ignoring his tone. "No hovering guards in the room, no interrupting the lessons. And you do not yell at him for not being normal." Arthur stared at her for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched until it felt like it might snap. Finally, he gave a curt, single nod. "Tomorrow, 8 a.m. Don't be late." Beatrice stood, taking the envelope. It felt incredibly heavy in her hands. She had just made a deal with the devil, all to save a little boy from a silent hell. The morning sun did nothing to warm the imposing stone facade of the estate. Beatrice arrived at exactly 7:55 a.m., clutching a worn canvas tote bag filled with children's books, flashcards, and a slightly battered stuffed bear. The security check at the gate was thorough and impersonal. A guard with dead eyes searched her bag, patted down, and escorted her up the winding driveway. Inside, the house felt even more cavernous in the daylight. A stern-faced housekeeper led Beatrice up a grand, sweeping staircase to the east wing. They stopped in front of a heavy oak door. "Master Leo's playroom," the housekeeper said, offering no smile before turning on her heel and marching away. Beatrice took a breath, adjusted her grip on her tote bag, and turned the handle. The room was massive, the size of a small apartment, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a manicured garden. But what struck Beatrice was the sheer, overwhelming volume of stuff. There were mountains of expensive toys, remote-controlled cars, complex train sets, robotic action figures that flashed lights and emitted loud, artificial sounds. It was a room designed by someone who thought throwing money at a child equated to understanding them. In the center of this plastic wasteland sat Leo. He was surrounded by a fortress of wooden building blocks, meticulously stacking them higher and higher. He didn't look up when she entered. He couldn't hear the door open. Beatrice didn't walk right up to him. She knew better than to startle a deaf child. Instead, she walked to a spot within his peripheral vision and gently stomped her foot on the hardwood floor. The vibration traveled across the planks. Leo stopped building. He turned his head slowly. When he saw her, his eyes widened slightly, but he didn't smile. He looked defensive, pulling his knees up to his chest, waiting for the inevitable disappointment he had come to expect from adults. Beatrice dropped her tote bag and sat down cross-legged on the floor, a good distance away. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at him, offering a soft, unthreatening smile. She reached into her bag and pulled out the battered stuffed bear. It was a simple, brown teddy bear with one slightly crooked button eye. She held the bear up, making sure Leo was watching her hands. Slowly, deliberately, she crossed her arms over her chest and hugged herself tight. "Bear." Leo watched, his face unreadable. He looked at the bear, then at her hands, then back to his blocks. He picked up a red block and placed it on his tower. He was ignoring her, testing her patience. Beatrice didn't push. She set the bear down and pulled out a bright red rubber ball. She held it up. She brought her hands together, fingers curved inward, tapping her fingertips together twice. "Ball." She rolled the ball gently across the floor. It stopped right next to Leo's fortress. He stared at it for a long time. Then, with a sudden, angry motion, he kicked the ball away. It bounced off a wall and rolled under a massive velvet sofa. He glared at her, challenging her to yell, to look disappointed, to act like all the others. Beatrice didn't flinch. She simply nodded. She raised her hands, palms facing downward, and moved them back and forth horizontally. Finished. She sat back and waited. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy with unsaid words and years of frustration. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Beatrice didn't move. She just sat there, being a calm, constant presence in his chaotic world. Slowly, Leo's posture began to relax. He realized she wasn't going to force him. She wasn't going to invade his space. He looked over at the spot where the ball had disappeared. Then, he looked back at Beatrice. He raised his small hands. Hesitantly, clumsily, he brought his fingertips together twice. Ball. Beatrice's heart soared, but she kept her face perfectly neutral. She nodded, standing up slowly. She walked over to the sofa, retrieved the red ball, and rolled it back to him. Leo caught it. He held it in his hands, staring at it. Then, he looked at Beatrice, and a tiny, fragile smile broke across his face. He tapped his fingertips together again. Ball. Yes. Beatrice mouthed the word, accompanying it with the sign. She walked closer, sitting just outside his fortress of blocks. She pointed to the red block in his hand. She brought her index finger to her lips, sliding it down her chin. Red. For the next 2 hours, they didn't play with the remote-controlled cars or the expensive robots. They sat on the floor, pointing at simple things. Blue, block, window, tree. Beatrice moved slowly, repeating the signs patiently, correcting his small fingers with gentle touches. Leo soaked it up like a sponge. His mind, trapped for so long in a silent void, was suddenly being handed the keys to the universe. His frustration melted away, replaced by an intense, burning focus. Unknown to Beatrice, the heavy oak door was cracked open a fraction of an inch. Standing in the darkened hallway, Arthur stood completely still, watching. He watched his son, the boy who threw violent tantrums, the boy who broke things, sitting peacefully on the floor. He watched Leo's face light up with understanding. He saw his son laugh, a silent, breathless shaking of his shoulders as Beatrice purposely made a silly face when signing the word monkey. Arthur leaned his head against the cool wood of the doorframe. He felt a sudden, sharp ache in his chest, a tightening of his throat that he hadn't experienced in years. It was a terrifying mixture of immense relief and profound, crushing guilt. He was the most powerful man in the city. He could buy entire blocks, silence enemies with a whisper, bend the world to his will. But looking into that room, watching a waitress in cheap clothes unlock his son's mind, Arthur realized how incredibly small and powerless he truly was. He turned away from the door, walking quietly down the hall, the silence of his own house suddenly feeling like a condemnation. 3 months bled into the changing season. The biting cold of winter surrendered to a hesitant spring, and within the imposing walls of the estate, a remarkable transformation was taking root. The suffocating silence that had always choked the massive house was breaking, replaced by the quiet, rhythmic tapping of fingers, the rustle of clothes, and the sound of silent, joyful laughter. Beatrice had become a fixture in the home. She arrived every morning at 8 and rarely left before sunset. The initial coldness she felt from the staff had thawed, replaced by a quiet respect as they witnessed the miraculous change in their young master. Leo was no longer the explosive, terrified child throwing tantrums in the dining room. He was a bright, deeply observant boy who practically vibrated with the need to communicate. They had moved beyond simple nouns. Beatrice was teaching him sentence structure, emotions, the nuances of expression. They spent afternoons in the sprawling gardens, turning the world into a classroom. It was a late Tuesday afternoon. The sun was casting long, golden shadows across the immaculate lawns. Beatrice and Leo were sitting on a stone bench near a massive fountain. Beatrice was teaching him the signs for different animals, turning the lesson into a game. She puffed out her cheeks and patted her stomach. Pig. Leo giggled, his shoulders shaking. He held his hands to his head, 2 fingers extended, and hopped up and down on the bench. Rabbit. Very good. Beatrice signed back, smiling warmly. Now what is this? She made a sweeping motion with her hand, simulating a long trunk. Elephant. As Leo concentrated, trying to mimic the motion, Beatrice felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The air around her seemed to grow heavier. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there. Arthur had a gravitational pull, a silent intensity that announced his presence before he even spoke. She turned her head slightly. Arthur was standing a few yards away, partially obscured by the shadow of a large oak tree. He was smoking a cigar, the gray smoke curling around his dark suit. He watched them with an unreadable expression, his eyes fixed on Leo's dancing hands. Beatrice sighed internally. Over the past 3 months, Arthur had become a ghost in his own home. He provided whatever she asked for: books, learning materials, specialized visual aids, but he kept his distance. He would watch them from balconies, from cracked doors, lingering on the periphery of his son's new world, but never stepping into it. "Stay here, Leo." Beatrice signed quickly. "Practice your animals." She stood up, brushing the grass from her skirt, and walked deliberately toward the oak tree. The bodyguards positioned discreetly around the garden tensed. But Arthur raised a single finger, silently commanding them to stand down. "You're hovering again," Beatrice said as she approached, keeping her voice low. Arthur took a slow drag from his cigar, exhaling the smoke away from her. "It is my house, Beatrice. I do not hover. I observe. You hide." She corrected him gently but firmly. "He knows you're there, Arthur. He always knows. He looks for you." Arthur shifted his gaze away from her, looking back out toward the city skyline visible over the estate walls. "He seems happy." "He is," Beatrice said. "He's brilliant. He's picking up vocabulary faster than I can teach him. But he's missing something." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I give him everything. The best doctors, the best security. Now, the best teacher. You give him things." Beatrice stepped closer, closing the distance between their two vastly different worlds. "He doesn't want things. He wants his father. He wants to tell you about the rabbit he saw in the garden. He wants to tell you he doesn't like the green vegetables the chef makes. He wants to talk to you. I make sure he is safe," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, a defensive edge creeping in. "My world is not safe, Beatrice. My world is violent. It is loud. If I bring him into it, he is already in it," Beatrice interrupted, frustration finally breaking through her professional facade. "He's your son. He lives in this fortress. He sees the guards with guns. He feels the tension when you walk into a room. You can't protect him from who you are by ignoring him. You are isolating him all over again." Arthur turned to face her fully, his eyes blazing with a sudden dark intensity. For a moment, Beatrice remembered who she was talking to: a man who commanded a criminal empire. A man who could destroy her life with a single word. She instinctively took a half step back, but Arthur didn't yell. Instead, the anger seemed to collapse inward, leaving behind a profound exhaustion. He looked down at his own hands. They were large, calloused, scarred from a lifetime of brutal violence. "I don't know how," Arthur whispered, the confession sounding like it was torn from his throat. "My hands. They break things. They hurt people. I don't know how to make them do what yours do. I am clumsy. If I try, and I fail." If he looks at me and sees that I can't even speak his language, Beatrice felt her anger instantly evaporate, replaced by a sudden, aching sympathy. Behind the terrifying facade of the Mafia boss was simply a terrified father, paralyzed by the fear of disappointing his child. She reached out, gently touching his arm. He flinched slightly at the contact, unaccustomed to such casual, fearless touch. "It's not about being perfect, Arthur," Beatrice said softly. "It's about trying. It's about showing him that he's worth the effort. It's hard. It will be awkward, but I can teach you, if you're willing." Arthur looked at her hand on his arm, then up at her face. He searched her eyes, looking for an angle, a trick, something he was used to finding in people. But he only saw genuine, clear honesty. Before he could answer, a loud, sharp crack echoed from the front of the estate. It sounded like thunder, but there were no clouds in the sky. Arthur's entire demeanor shifted instantly. The vulnerable father vanished, replaced in a millisecond by the ruthless boss. His hand went instinctively beneath his suit jacket. "Get him inside," Arthur barked, his voice sharp and commanding. "Now, to the panic room." The peace of the afternoon was shattered. The nightmare Arthur had been trying to keep outside the gates had just breached the walls. Panic is loud. It is the sound of shattering glass, shouting voices, and the frantic pounding of boots on hardwood floors. As Beatrice sprinted across the lawn toward Leo, the air was suddenly split by the terrifying, rhythmic chatter of automatic gunfire coming from the front gates. "Leo!" Beatrice screamed, forgetting for a split second that the sound was useless to him. She reached the stone bench just as Leo looked up, sensing the heavy vibrations through the ground. His eyes were wide with sudden, sharp terror. The guards in the garden had drawn their weapons, shouting into radios, moving in a tight, protective perimeter toward the house. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She grabbed Leo's hand, pulling him off the bench. She didn't sign. There was no time. She just gripped him tight and ran toward the side entrance of the estate. Inside, the house was chaos. Maids were screaming, seeking cover. Heavily armed men in tactical gear were rushing down the hallways, turning the elegant home into a war zone. Beatrice pulled Leo close to her side, shielding his body with her own, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Miss Beatrice, this way." A large man, one of Arthur's personal bodyguards, whose name she thought was Marco, grabbed her arm. He practically dragged her and Leo down a hidden staircase off the main kitchen, plunging them into the cool, dark basement. They moved past rows of wine racks until Marco stopped before a wall of solid concrete. He rapidly punched a code into a hidden keypad. With a heavy, mechanical groan, a thick steel door slid open. Marco shoved them inside. "Stay here. Do not open the door until the boss comes," Marco ordered, his face pale and sweating. Before Beatrice could reply, the heavy steel door slammed shut, sealing them in absolute darkness. A moment later, emergency lights flickered on, bathing the small, windowless room in a dim, eerie red glow. The room was sparse, reinforced steel walls, a chemical toilet, a radio, and a crate of bottled water. The air was instantly stifling, thick with the smell of ozone and fear. Beatrice dropped to her knees. Leo was trembling violently. He was making high-pitched, panicked noises, a raw sound born of pure terror and utter confusion. He couldn't hear the gunfire outside, but he felt the concussive thuds of explosions rattling the walls of the panic room. He didn't understand why they were locked in a red box, why the men with guns were running, why his world had suddenly fractured. He thrashed against Beatrice, his small fists hitting her arms as he tried to scramble toward the steel door. He wanted out. He wanted his father. "Leo, no, stop," Beatrice gasped, struggling to hold him. She realized quickly that trying to restrain him was only escalating his panic. He felt trapped. She forced herself to take a deep, shaky breath. She had to project calm, even if she felt like she was dying of terror. She let go of him and moved back slightly, putting herself directly in his line of sight under the red emergency lights. She brought her hands up. She kept her movements slow, smooth, and exaggeratedly calm. "Look at me," she signed, tapping her eyes and pointing to him. "Look at me." Leo was hyperventilating, tears streaming down his face, but the familiar motion caught his attention. He looked at her hands. Beatrice placed both hands flat over her heart, breathing in deeply, letting her shoulders rise and fall dramatically. "Breathe." She waited. Leo watched her chest. He took a ragged, shuddering breath. "We are safe," she signed, crossing her arms over her chest and pulling them apart into fists. "Safe." She pointed upward, toward the ceiling. "Father is fixing it. Father is strong." Leo's crying slowed to quiet hiccups. He looked around the terrifying red room, then back to Beatrice. He raised a trembling hand and formed the sign for scared. "I know," Beatrice mouthed, her own eyes filling with tears. She nodded, signing back. "Me too, but we are together." She needed to distract him. She needed to pull his mind away from the vibrations shaking the walls. She sat cross-legged on the cold concrete floor and patted the space in front of her. Hesitantly, Leo crawled over and sat facing her. Under the blood-red emergency lights, while a cartel war waged above them, Beatrice began to tell a story. She didn't use her voice. She used her hands, her face, her entire body. She told him the story of a brave knight signing the helmet, the sword, the horse who had to hide in a magic cave while a storm raged outside. She exaggerated her facial expressions, making funny, brave faces to represent the knight, and fierce, growling faces to represent the storm. She moved her hands gracefully, painting a vivid picture in the air between them. The panic room ceased to be a steel cage. It became the magic cave. The concussive thuds from above weren't bombs. They were the thunder of the dragon outside. Leo watched her with absolute, unwavering focus. His breathing leveled out. He stopped trembling. The terror in his eyes was slowly replaced by the captivating pull of the narrative. He was locked onto her hands, his imagination overriding his fear. When Beatrice signed that the knight finally found the magic treasure, Leo even managed a small, shaky smile. They sat like that for what felt like hours. The silence in the room was profound, punctuated only by the occasional heavy thud from the ceiling. Beatrice's arms ached from continuous signing, her mind exhausted by the adrenaline, but she didn't stop. She kept the story going, spinning a protective web of silent words around the terrified boy. Suddenly, the red light above the door flashed green. The heavy steel bolts ground open with a screeching sound. The door swung outward. Standing in the doorway was Arthur. He looked terrible. His suit was torn, his white shirt stained with blood that Beatrice prayed wasn't his. He held a high-powered rifle in his right hand, his face covered in soot and sweat. The smell of cordite and death rolled into the room off his clothes. He stepped inside, his chest heaving, his eyes scanning the room frantically until they locked onto his son. Arthur expected to find Leo in the middle of a screaming, uncontrollable meltdown. He expected to find a shattered child. Instead, he found his son sitting calmly on the floor, watching Beatrice's hands finish the story of the brave knight. Leo saw his father. He stood up, ran across the room, and threw his arms around Arthur's legs. Arthur dropped the rifle. It clattered against the concrete. He fell to his knees, ignoring the blood and the dirt, and pulled his son into a desperate, crushing embrace. He buried his face in Leo's hair, his broad shoulders shaking with silent, ragged sobs. Over Leo's head, Arthur looked up at Beatrice. She was leaning against the wall, exhausted, pale, but safe. In that dim, red-lit basement, surrounded by the violent wreckage of his life, Arthur looked at the waitress who had just shielded his son's mind from terror, using nothing but her hands. He didn't speak. He couldn't. But the look in his eyes, a look of profound, absolute gratitude, said more than 1,000 spoken words ever could. The aftermath of the siege left the estate deeply scarred. The massive front gates were twisted metal, several windows were boarded up, and the heavy smell of smoke and industrial cleaner lingered in the hallways. The rival syndicate's attack had been repelled, but the illusion of absolute safety had been violently shattered. For 3 days, the house was on lockdown. Beatrice stayed in the guest wing, refusing to leave Leo's side. The boy was clingy, shadows of fear returning whenever he felt an unexpected vibration. Beatrice used every sign, every story, every ounce of her patience to keep him anchored. On the 4th night, after Leo had finally fallen into a deep, exhausted sleep, there was a soft knock on Beatrice's door. She opened it to find Arthur. He had changed out of his suits over the last few days, wearing simple dark slacks and a black sweater. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by stress and a lack of sleep. "Is he asleep?" Arthur asked quietly. Beatrice nodded, stepping aside to let him see into the dimly lit room. "He went down about 20 minutes ago. He's okay, Arthur. He's resilient." Arthur stood in the doorway, watching the steady rise and fall of his son's chest under the blankets. "Because of you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he was clearly struggling to contain. "Marco told me what happened. He said the boy didn't scream once in the panic room. He said you kept him silent." "He was scared," Beatrice said, leaning against the doorframe. "I just gave him something else to focus on." Arthur turned his gaze from Leo to Beatrice. The terrifying, intimidating aura of the Mafia boss was entirely gone. In the quiet of the night hallway, he was stripped bare. "I have spent my life building walls," Arthur said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I built an empire to ensure nothing could ever touch me, or mine, and it took 12 men with guns to show me that the walls don't matter. If I can't reach him, if I can't comfort my own son when he thinks he's going to die, then I am the weakest man on earth." He took a slow, deep breath, running a hand over his tired face. "Down in the garden, before the attack. You said you could teach me." Beatrice straightened up. "I did." Arthur swallowed hard, a physical manifestation of his pride breaking. "I need you to teach me, please." It was the first time she had ever heard him use the word please. They went down to Arthur's study. The fire was unlit, the room feeling cavernous and cold. Beatrice pulled 2 chairs away from the imposing desk and placed them facing each other in the center of the room, stripping away the power dynamic of the boss behind the desk. Arthur sat down. He looked stiff, acutely uncomfortable. This was a man used to mastering his environment instantly, used to commanding with a look. Now, he was stepping into a world where he was completely helpless. Beatrice sat opposite him. "We start simple," she said. "The alphabet is important later, but right now, you need functional words. You need connection." She held up her hands. First, look at me. Not my hands, my face. Sign language isn't just fingers, it's expression. Your face has to match the word. Arthur nodded rigidly, his dark eyes locking onto hers. Good. Now, bring your hand up. Arthur raised his right hand. It was a terrifying hand. Thick fingers, knuckles scarred with pale lines, a heavy gold ring on his pinky. It was a hand built for violence. Open your hand flat, Beatrice instructed, doing the same. Now, tap the thumb of your open hand twice against your forehead. Arthur mirrored her movement. His hand was stiff, the motion jerky. He tapped his forehead. That means father, Beatrice said softly. Arthur stopped. He held his hand in the air, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked at his hand as if he were seeing it for the first time. The hand that had signed death warrants was now signing the most important word in his life. Father, Arthur whispered aloud, tapping his forehead again. Slower this time. Now, Beatrice continued, her voice gentle, guiding him. Point to yourself. Index finger to the chest. That's I. Arthur pointed to his chest. Cross your arms over your chest, making fists, and pull them tight against your heart. Love. Arthur crossed his massive arms over his chest. He looked awkward, like a bear trying to perform ballet, but his eyes were blazing with intense concentration. And finally, point outward, toward the person you are speaking to. You. Arthur pointed his finger at the empty air beside Beatrice. Put it together, Beatrice urged quietly. Arthur took a deep breath. His face, normally an unreadable mask of stone, softened. He pointed to his chest. I. He crossed his arms tightly over his heart. Love. He pointed outward. You. He sat back, exhaling a long, shuddering breath. I love you. He needs to see that, Beatrice said, her own throat tight with emotion. He needs to see you say it, Arthur. Not just buy him things. He needs your hands to tell him. For the next 3 hours, they didn't leave the study. Arthur, the ruthless king of the underworld, became an obedient, desperate student. He stumbled. His thick fingers fumbled the delicate shapes of the signs. He got frustrated, cursing under his breath when he couldn't get the motion for safe or sorry correct. But Beatrice didn't let him quit. She corrected his posture, physically guiding his hands, showing him how to loosen his wrists. She showed him how to raise his eyebrows for a question, how to soften his eyes for comfort. By 3 a.m, Arthur was exhausted, his mind swimming with new gestures and movements. But as he sat in the quiet study, practicing the sign for sun over and over again, the heavy, suffocating darkness that usually surrounded him seemed to have lifted. For the first time in years, he felt a genuine spark of hope. He was learning the language of his child. He was finally finding a way to bring his son home. The progress over the next 2 weeks was intoxicating. Arthur dedicated himself to learning with the same ruthless obsession he applied to his empire. He practiced constantly, and the first time he correctly signed "Good morning, Leo," the boy had launched out of his chair and tackled his father in a hug. The ice was melting. The family was healing. But in Arthur's world, peace was always fragile. It happened on a rainy Thursday. Marco, the head bodyguard, abruptly escorted Beatrice into Arthur's study. The room felt freezing. The terrifying, unapproachable boss from the diner had returned. Spread across his mahogany desk were surveillance photographs of Beatrice talking to a man in a cheap suit outside a coffee shop, Detective Miller. A vice cop who has been trying to build a RICO case against me for 3 years, Arthur said, his voice dripping with venom. And here you are, having coffee with him 3 days after my home was attacked. He was the detective assigned to my sister's case years ago. We just ran into each other, Beatrice pleaded, panic rising in her chest. I shielded your son. Do you really think I'm a spy? Arthur looked away, the internal struggle painfully visible on his face. The paranoid mafia boss warring with the father who had finally found a connection. I cannot afford to be wrong. If you are an informant, I am putting my son's life in danger. Every person in my life is a potential weakness. Arthur, please. You're isolating him again. You're letting your paranoia destroy the only good thing in his life. Arthur closed his eyes for a long second. When he opened them, only the boss remained. You are done here. Marco will escort you out. Despite her desperate pleas for Leo's sake, Marco pulled her roughly from the room. Arthur stood alone in the silence, feeling a sickening, hollow rot open up in his stomach. Upstairs, Leo sat with a new picture book, waiting for Beatrice, unaware that the heavy, dark silence was about to return. 3 days. It had been 3 days since Beatrice was thrown out of the estate. For Beatrice, it was a purgatory of pacing her tiny apartment, staring at her phone, crying until her eyes were swollen shut. For the estate, it was a descent back into hell. The regression Beatrice had warned about didn't happen slowly. It happened instantaneously. When Leo realized Beatrice wasn't coming back, he didn't cry. He simply shut down. He stopped signing. He refused to look at Arthur. He sat in the corner of his sprawling playroom, staring blankly at the wall, a hollow shell of the vibrant boy he had been just days prior. Arthur tried to sign to him, tried to use the clumsy, broken words he had learned. But Leo simply turned his back. The rejection was absolute, and it cut Arthur deeper than any bullet ever could. On the afternoon of the 4th day, the nightmare mutated. Arthur was in a meeting with his lieutenants in the dining room when the frantic voice of the housekeeper echoed down the hall. Master Leo is gone." Arthur overturned the heavy dining table in his haste to stand up. The entire estate went into absolute panic mode. Dozens of armed guards tore the house apart, searching every closet, every hidden room, the sprawling gardens. Nothing. Marco came running up to Arthur, his face ashen. "Boss." The delivery gate at the rear of the kitchen. The boy. He must have slipped out. Arthur felt his blood turn to ice. His 6-year-old son, entirely deaf, unable to hear a car horn, a shout, or a siren, was wandering alone in a city that Arthur himself had helped make dangerous. "Mobilize everyone!" Arthur roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "Every man we have. Tear the city apart. If anyone touches a hair on his head, I will burn this city to the ground." Arthur didn't wait for his men. He ran to his car, tires screaming as he tore out of the driveway. He didn't drive toward the safe zones. He drove straight into the belly of the beast. He knew where Leo would go. He knew what the boy was looking for. 20 minutes later, Arthur's black SUV slammed onto the curb outside Beatrice's apartment building. He didn't bother knocking. He kicked the crumbling door of the building open and practically flew up the stairs. He hammered on her door with his fists. Beatrice opened it, looking pale and exhausted, but the anger in her eyes vanished the second she saw Arthur's face. He looked broken, terrified, completely unhinged. "He's gone," Arthur gasped, leaning against the doorframe, struggling for air. "Leo. He ran away. He's trying to find you." Beatrice didn't ask questions. She didn't demand apologies. She grabbed her coat and ran down the stairs ahead of him. They drove frantically through the streets. Beatrice directed him, knowing the route Leo would instinctively take if he remembered the car ride from the diner all those months ago. "He can't hear the traffic, Arthur," Beatrice said, her voice trembling, staring out the window at the crowded, chaotic streets. "He can't hear the crosswalk signals. If he walks into an intersection..." "Don't." Arthur gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. "Don't say it." They reached the bustling commercial district, a maze of 4-lane roads, aggressive taxi drivers, and rushing crowds. They parked on the sidewalk, abandoning the car, and ran into the crush of people. "Leo!" Arthur screamed, shoving people aside, his voice cracking. But it was useless. 1,000 people could scream his name, and the boy wouldn't know. Beatrice pushed through the crowd, her eyes scanning the sea of adults, looking for a small, frightened face. They reached the intersection of 5th and Main, the busiest, most dangerous crossing in the district. Cars were honking, trucks rumbling, a cacophony of urban noise. Then, Beatrice saw him. On the opposite side of the massive 6-lane avenue, standing dangerously close to the curb, was a small boy in a blue jacket. Leo. He looked terrified, spinning in circles, completely overwhelmed by the visual chaos, unable to process the danger rushing past him inches away. "Arthur! There!" Beatrice screamed, pointing. Arthur saw him. He lunged forward to run across, but the pedestrian light turned red. A massive wall of traffic buses, delivery trucks, speeding cabs surged forward, creating an impenetrable, deadly barrier of moving steel between them and the boy. They couldn't cross. They couldn't yell. Across the street, Leo, panicked and disoriented, took a step off the curb. He was trying to cross against the light, stepping right into the path of an oncoming city bus. No! Arthur roared, slamming his hands against a stopped truck, utterly powerless. Beatrice acted on pure instinct. She climbed up onto the hood of a parked taxi, elevating herself above the crowd. She waved her arms frantically, not yelling, just making massive, sweeping motions to catch his peripheral vision. Through a brief gap in the rushing traffic, Leo caught the movement. He stopped, right on the edge of the lane, and looked across the sea of cars. He saw Beatrice on the taxi. Next to her, he saw his father. Beatrice didn't hesitate. She threw her hands up, making the motions as large and sharp as possible. Stop. She thrust her flat palm forward aggressively. Stay there. Leo froze. He recognized the signs. Arthur saw what she was doing. He scrambled up onto the hood of the taxi next to her. The Mafia boss, in his expensive suit, stood on a cab in the middle of a crowded intersection, ignoring the stares and shouts of the pedestrians. He looked across the traffic at his son. His hands were shaking, but his mind flashed back to the quiet study, to the long hours of practice. He forced his hands to be steady. He raised his right hand, tapping his forehead twice. Father. He pointed to his chest. I. He crossed his arms over his chest tightly. Love. He pointed directly at Leo across the street. You. Leo stood frozen on the curb, the massive bus roaring past him, ruffling his hair. He stared at his father. He saw the terrifying man making the signs, saw the tears streaming down his father's face. Arthur didn't stop. He signed it again, larger, more desperate. I. Love. You. Stay. Safe. Leo's chin trembled. He raised his own small hands, bringing his fingertips together twice. Safe. Then, he signed back. I. Love. You. He took a step backward, away from the roaring traffic, safely onto the center of the sidewalk, and waited. When the light finally turned, Arthur didn't walk. He sprinted across the empty asphalt, falling to his knees on the concrete before he even reached the curb, catching Leo as the boy ran into his arms. Arthur crushed him to his chest, burying his face in his son's jacket, weeping openly in the middle of the street. Beatrice walked across slowly, the adrenaline leaving her body, leaving her shaking. Arthur looked up at her from the pavement, still clutching his son. The paranoia was gone. The boss was gone. He was just a father who had almost lost his soul, looking at the woman who had saved it. The air in the estate felt entirely different a year later. The oppressive, cold silence that had once defined the walls was completely gone, replaced by the warm, vibrant energy of a home that was actually being lived in. The heavy velvet curtains were pulled back, letting the spring sunlight flood the hallways. In the garden, a small group of children were running across the grass, their silent laughter carrying on the breeze. It was Leo's 7th birthday party, and for the first time in his life, he had friends over. Some were from the specialized school he now attended half-days. Others were the children of Arthur's staff. Standing on the patio, watching the chaos with a relaxed smile, was Arthur. He wore a light linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up. He looked 5 years younger. The deep, stress-carved lines around his mouth had softened. He felt a gentle tap on his shoulder. He turned. Beatrice stood there, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. She wasn't wearing a waitress uniform, nor the rigid clothes of a scared employee. She wore a simple, elegant sundress, looking completely at ease in the sprawling estate. She wasn't just Leo's teacher anymore. She was the center of gravity that held their new world together. "They're going to destroy your prize rose bushes," Beatrice signed, balancing the glasses in one hand while using the other, a habit they had both developed to ensure Leo never felt excluded from a conversation. Arthur chuckled, accepting a glass. "Let them. I can buy more roses." "I can't buy that." He pointed toward the lawn. Leo was in the center of the group, enthusiastically explaining the rules of a game using fluid, rapid sign language. The other children were watching him, completely engaged, following his lead. Arthur took a sip of his lemonade, his eyes following Beatrice as she leaned against the stone railing beside him. The transition hadn't been easy. After the incident in the city, Arthur had systematically dismantled the most violent, forward-facing parts of his empire. He had fired Marco. He had stepped back from the street-level operations, moving his assets into legitimate businesses. It had cost him millions, and it had cost him influence. But watching his son play, he knew it was the cheapest price he had ever paid. "You're quiet today," Beatrice observed, turning her head to look at him. "Just thinking," Arthur said. He set his glass down and turned to face her fully. He raised his hands, his movements now confident, graceful, and natural. "I was thinking about the diner," Arthur signed, "about a waitress who was brave enough to yell at a monster." Beatrice smiled, a soft blush touching her cheeks. She was just tired of seeing people not understand each other. Arthur reached out, his large hand gently taking hers. He didn't sign the next part. He spoke it aloud, his voice low and incredibly gentle, meant only for her. "I spent my entire life acquiring power," Arthur said, looking deep into her eyes. "I thought power was the ability to make people fear you, to make them do what you want." He looked back out at his son, who was currently laughing, signing a joke to a friend. "But I was wrong," Arthur continued, looking back at Beatrice. "True power, true strength, is having the patience to learn how to speak to the people you love. You gave me that, Beatrice. You gave me my son. You gave me my life back." Beatrice squeezed his hand, her heart swelling with a profound, quiet joy. She looked at the man who had once terrified her, now standing beside her as a partner, a father, and a protector in the truest sense. From the lawn, Leo suddenly stopped running. He looked up at the patio, spotting Arthur and Beatrice standing close together. A massive, beaming smile broke across his face. He raised his hands high above his head, making sure they were watching. He tapped his forehead. "Father." He pointed to Beatrice. "Mother." He crossed his arms tightly over his chest. "Love." Arthur felt a tear slip down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He raised his free hand, Beatrice raising hers alongside his. In perfect unison, in the bright sunlight of their new life, they signed back. "We love you too." Arthur's journey proves that the thickest walls we build are rarely made of stone. They are built from fear, pride, and the refusal to be vulnerable. True strength isn't found in commanding an empire or silencing a room. It is found in the courage to admit what we do not know, and the humility to learn the language of those who need us most. Beatrice showed that compassion is the most disruptive force on earth, capable of breaking down the hardest of hearts and giving a silent child his voice. If this story of transformation, unconditional love, and the power of breaking the silence moved you, please leave a like, share this story with someone you care about, and subscribe for more emotional, cinematic stories